My name is Marla Crane, and I am the wife of Stephen Crane. We were married for 42 years. The last 31 years were the best of my life. The first 11 years were not. Yet tears stream down my face as I think about the man that I loved. Stephen died 15 days ago. 6 days ago, we buried him. Before he died, he shared this story with me. Even as I commit his story to paper, I truly don't know what to think about the odd nature of it. I met Stephen in college. We met through mutual friends. At the time, Stephen was dating another girl. I thought he was good-looking, but there didn't seem to be any instant spark. I honestly didn't think much of him. However, as college unfolded, we ended up having the same circle of friends. Almost every weekend, we'd run into each other at a house party or a group dinner. Sometimes we would see each other on the way to class. We always stopped for polite conversation with one another. I never expected that he was interested in any kind of relationship with me. The timing just always seemed to be off. After 4 years of college, we each went our own way. Stephen and I didn't even exchange contact information. I honestly never thought I would see him again. After taking a year off to recharge, I moved to Chicago for graduate school. One day, in my second year of graduate school, I was sitting at a little cafe in downtown Chicago, working on my master's thesis. I felt a tap on my shoulder. When I turned and looked up, it was Stephen. We greeted each other with a warm hug. He sat down and we chatted for the next hour. Back in college, Stephen had been a business major. He parlayed that into a career in banking and finance. He landed a high-paying job in Chicago and had actually been here the entire time I was here, working on my graduate degree. An hour flew by, and Stephen had to return to work. This time, when we parted, we did exchange phone numbers. A couple of days later, Stephen asked me to have dinner with him. Before long, we began dating, and soon we were in love. After I finished my graduate studies, I took a job as an administrator for a large hospital in Chicago, and just about 2 years after reconnecting in that little cafe, Stephen proposed to me. Several months later, we married. Everything seemed perfect. But they say you never really know someone until you've lived with them for a while. There's definitely a lot of truth in this. Stephen had a nice high-rise apartment in downtown Chicago. After we married, I moved in with him. Once we started living together, I noticed the red flags. Maybe the red flags were there all along, and young love just blinded me. I don't know. Stephen always was a bit impatient and temperamental. However, once we were married, I truly saw how bad it was, particularly if he had a bit to drink. At first, if I did something he didn't like, it started with passive-aggressive comments. Early on, the comments would be made quietly. This was bad enough. But in time, Stephen would make rude comments to me in front of other people. Before long, we couldn't shop together. Stephen just did not have the patience for it. We used to go to the mall together. He would shop for his things, and I would shop for mine. He always finished first. As a woman, I always took longer to look at clothing or jewellery. On more than one occasion, I found myself alone. I couldn't find my husband. I'd find a payphone and call him only to find out that he left me and went home. He always refused to come back for me. After a few frustrated cab rides home, I just started shopping without him. Yet all of this paled in comparison to the psychological and physical abuse. Stephen could hold a grudge. If he got angry with me, he would curse at me. The first time it happened, I was so shocked that I cried. He apologized profusely, yet days later, it happened again. I was able to bear with the cursing and the put-downs. It was the silence that hurt worse. If Stephen was really upset, he would ignore me for hours or even days. I don't know why, but for me, the killing silence always cut me so much deeper than any amount of yelling and screaming. One day, he put his hands on me. After an especially rough week of work, we decided to go to dinner on a Friday night. An issue came up at my work, which caused me to be late coming home. I was over an hour late. By the time I walked in the door, Stephen was already drunk. I apologized profusely as I told him to give me a minute to freshen up. Before I knew it, he was cursing at me. When I stood up to face him, he pushed me. I fell and knocked over the nightstand. As I struggled to stand up, Stephen initially tried to help me. Then I lost it and started cursing at him as I burst into tears. Stephen placed a fist right into my gut and doubled me over onto the bed. It hurt so badly that I couldn't breathe. Stephen stormed out of the house and did not come home until late into the night. I honestly did not care. We had been married for just over a year at this point. This was the closest I came to divorcing him. That week, I started researching how divorce worked. That's when I learned that I was pregnant. I know that some may be reading this story now and think, how could she put up with such a husband? Yet, as a girl who grew up in a devout Christian household, divorce just was not an option. Even without the pregnancy, I don't know if I could have gone through with a divorce. After I told Stephen that I was pregnant, we had a long talk about his anger issues. I told him that if he ever hit me again, I would leave him, whether there was a baby or not. He promised me he would change. But neither of us really meant it. Stephen got worse. And I just learned to bear with it and stay out of the way. For 10 more years, this was my life. Stephen would lose his temper, and the children and I would stay out of the way. I came to accept that the man I married simply was not a good man. He was an awful husband, and he was not a very loving father. The only thing Stephen was good at was earning a high income to provide for the family. Then one day, it happened. I got a call from Stephen's office. His secretary frantically told me that Stephen collapsed during a meeting. An ambulance came for him, and he was on his way to a hospital. It turned out that it was my hospital. I rushed down to the ER. I actually waited there for 10 minutes before they arrived with Stephen. It turned out that Stephen suffered a stroke. Stephen's stroke was massive. He should have died. Yet somehow Stephen was still alive, but he went into a coma. For 2 weeks, Stephen remained in a coma. The best doctors we had told me that it was highly likely that Stephen would recover. If by some miracle he did survive, he would not be the same. Most of the doctors told me that I needed to consider taking him off of life support. I discussed the situation with Stephen's parents. They said that because I was his wife, they would leave any final decision to me. But his mother stated that she wanted to give him every opportunity to recover. Because of that, I decided to wait. During the 3rd week, Stephen opened his eyes. I rushed up to his room from my office when I got the news. I cried. Stephen blinked. Afterwards, no one could believe Stephen's recovery. Within a couple of days, he was breathing on his own. 8 days later, Stephen spoke. And in less than 2 weeks, Stephen was sitting up on his own. He had full use of all of his extremities. In a mere 6 weeks after suffering a massive stroke, my husband, Stephen Crane, walked out of that hospital on his own. Everyone called it a medical miracle. I just always considered it divine intervention, not just the stroke and recovery, but the change in Stephen that came afterwards. Before his stroke, Stephen was simply an awful person. He was impatient, he was mean, he was selfish, he was greedy. He was a highly successful financier. He was highly respected and feared, but his co-workers despised him. Most of his family disliked him. All of my family hated him. Our 3 children loved him, since he was their father. But there was no affection or trust. After the stroke, it was like God put Stephen Crane through a heavenly washing machine. I got a completely different husband back from the hospital. He was kind, he was attentive, he was considerate, he was patient. He made time for me and the children. The cruel words, the cold shoulder, all of the thoughtless actions that were commonplace before, simply vanished. I tried to talk to Stephen about it in the months after his recovery. He said he wanted to be a better husband and father. He said, going through something like that changes a man. I just left it at that. Stephen had been on the verge of death. His temper and high blood pressure taxed his body to the point of having a stroke. I reasoned that if that doesn't change a person, nothing would. And that was that. For the next 30 years, my life and my marriage to Stephen was as happy as any woman could ask for. He was an ideal husband. He built strong bonds with each of our children. He left his job in the banking world and became the CEO of a respectable non-profit company serving disadvantaged people all over the world. Stephen even started going to church with me. We became a pillar couple in our church. When Stephen turned 66 years old, he caught a cold, or what he thought was a cold. His voice was raspy, and he developed a slight cough. After 2 weeks of taking over-the-counter meds, Stephen went in to see our family doctor. One test led to another, and it was discovered that Stephen had a malignant tumour in his throat. Immediate chemotherapy sent the cancer into remission. However, 6 months later, the cancer returned with a vengeance. As we sat in our living room together, knowing that Stephen's time was short, he wrote for me the following. His voice had become so weak that he could only communicate with me by writing. This is what he wrote.
My dearest love, what I am about to tell you will sound crazy. This is why I have not told you about it until now. I simply did not know how to articulate it to you without you thinking I had gone mad. The past 31 years of my life with you and the children have been nothing short of a waking dream. In the blink of an eye, 31 years passed as if they were mere days. I cherish you with all of my heart, and I know that your affection for me is equal and mutual. You have known me as Stephen Crane, the man you met in college and later married. But in truth, my true name is William McCabe, and I have been living in the body of Stephen Crane. Believe me, dear, I know how insane it is to read that sentence. I cannot believe I wrote it. 31 years ago, while driving along the turnpike, a semi-truck merged into my lane carelessly. My little compact car was forced into the concrete divider. I lost control and flipped several times. An ambulance rushed my crushed body to the hospital. Somehow I clung to life until I reached the hospital. After several futile attempts by ER doctors to save me, I died. In that hospital room, my spirit detached from my broken body. I hovered above the entire scene and saw it all. Afterwards, a light appeared. It was a beautiful and warm, white light. I was tempted to go towards it, yet something told me not to. For some reason, I felt like all of this was a mistake. I shouldn't be dead, not yet. I felt so strongly that I had more to do in life. I floated away from the light. I made my way out of ER and began to wander the hallways of that hospital. I saw people everywhere, both living and dead. In that state, the living people seemed far away, almost fuzzy. I could hear them speaking, but they sounded like they were underwater. And in that state, it was the dead people that I could see the most clearly. Some knew they were dead, others did not and were undoubtedly confused. Like many others, I aimlessly wandered those hallways until I ended up in the ICU. I chanced upon the room of Stephen Crane. His lifeless body laid in the hospital bed, but his spirit stood watch over it. When Stephen noticed that I was another spirit looking at him, he cursed me and attempted to shoo me out. He was violent and very aggressive, but I could tell that he was more terrified than anything else, like a cornered animal who was unsure of what to do with the dilemma he found himself in. As Stephen took a few steps towards me, something strange happened. The best way I can describe it is a hole opened up in the floor. The hole was black. Black vaporous tendrils reached out of that hole. It was quite frightening. Suddenly, dozens of figures climbed up and out of that hole. They were not very tall. They were the size of toddlers. But the figures were completely black. There were no facial features. Imagine a shadow becoming a full 3-dimensional being. That's what those things looked like. I immediately backed up into a corner. A few of the small creatures turned towards me. If they had eyes, I imagine they would have looked at me. But clearly I was not their purpose. They quickly poured into the room where Stephen's spirit was. I looked away in fear, but I could hear him screaming and wailing. Nurses and doctors came and went past the open door, yet they paid no heed to the horrific cries. Finally, I worked up enough nerve to look. Those small shadow things were tearing Stephen's spirit apart. Their little claw-like hands dug into him. Each time they did so, he howled with agony. 7 or 8 of the creatures climbed onto his back, ripping and tearing at him. Stephen collapsed to the ground. Soon the creatures dragged Stephen towards the hole. He resisted in vain. He cried out, reaching towards me for help. I just shook with fear. Suddenly Stephen managed to break free, and in a few steps he was on me. He clutched for my arms. Somehow, since we were both spirits, his hands connected with my arms without issue. But quickly the creatures were back on him. They hissed and cried an awful demonic cry as they clawed and pulled him away. With a swipe meant for Stephen, one of the creatures made contact with me. My arm burned like it was suddenly set on fire. I winced as the creature hissed at me. With a last glance, I saw Stephen being dragged into that black hole. A couple of the shadow creatures poked their unnatural heads out and turned towards me, and in an instinctive reaction to the sheer horror of the moment, I entered the body of Stephen Crane. Moments later, I opened my new eyes. Soon your beautiful face, filled with tears, was looking down on me. As William McCabe, I had no close family. My parents had died years before my body died. I had no one to reach out to or contact. I had no clue how my spirit was able to enter into the body of your husband, Stephen Crane. But somehow here I was. I came to the conclusion that I was being given a second chance at life. When this body miraculously healed, I resolved myself to never take any aspect of life for granted, particularly the most important things in life. I chose to live as Stephen Crane. I chose to care for the wife he married as if she were my own. I chose to be the best father I could to the 3 wonderful children gifted to me, and I chose to live a life of gratitude for the new lease I had been given. I don't know if I fulfilled those resolutions, but truly, I hope I did. My dearest Marla, how on earth could I possibly have told you all of that 31 years ago? You would have simply thought that I was suffering delusions from the stroke. If I persisted, you might have thought that I was crazy and had me committed. Believe me, over the years, I have considered my own sanity in this entire affair. But my conclusion is always the same. I am and have always been very much in full control of all of my physical and mental faculties. I remember it all, every bit of it. It was not a delusion, it was not a dream. And the impact of my experiences in the ethereal world have not lessened 1 ounce since that day. For this reason and so many more, I have loved you to the best of my ability since the day I looked upon you with these eyes. I can feel this body weakening by the minute due to this unforgiving disease. But rest assured, my love, that I will continue to love you even after these eyes close for good. And soon I shall eagerly wait for you on the other side. Come slowly to me, beloved wife.